Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
The number one greeting in my faith is peace.
You're living at a time of extremism, a time of revolution, a time when there's got to be a change.
You're gonna find something, not 100%, every community. Rather than tear each other down, why not build each other up?
Welcome to the second episode of the first season, The Wretched of the Earth, of the fourth podcast. I am Ali Wazir.
I am Ibrahim Ali.
And I'm Talha Muhammad.
And you can help us grow by giving us a follow on Instagram at thefourth.productions and Twitter at thefourth_prod, Prod. Back to the show. Let's continue from where we left off last week.
By the end of the first episode, we had discussed the colonized mentality of Muslims from the lens of current affairs, including the OIC, brain drain, and protests. We hit upon the transition into this episode, Hollywood, and how it plays a major part in shaping our culture.
As we said, this week we're going to talk about how the colonized mentality of Muslims plays a role into, or a way into our own culture.
Yeah, since the beginning of European colonization of the Muslim world, Muslims have begun to develop an inferiority complex that is reinforced and carried on in our mentality, even now in the post-colonial era.
This has infiltrated our culture deeply, and today we're going to talk about its impact in the films we watch, the sports we play, and our perception of race.
Yeah, so we're all familiar with Hollywood, right, the film industry of the United States. Hollywood produces on average about 500 feature films a year, and it's by far the most influential film industry of anywhere in the world. The second most influential film industry, but actually larger than Hollywood, is Bollywood, the film industry of India. And Hollywood and Bollywood combined sold 6.2 billion tickets in 2001. So you guys can just imagine how much it's grown in these last 20 years. It's certain that what these industries choose to show in their films affects a majority of the global population, right? 6.2 billion. And I mean, in 2001, the global population hadn't even hit 7 billion yet. So, you know, pretty much almost 90% of the global population. And I'm sure it's higher today. Both of these countries have chosen to use this influence to make films and television that entrench the colonial mentality of Muslims.
I think this plays a big role when you're looking at movies, whether you see Muslims depicted as terrorists, whether you see them depicted as essentially the antagonist in any film, whether it be Bollywood or Hollywood. And I think that plays a big role in how media in general shapes how other individuals see Muslims. Ibrahim, what are your thoughts on that, man?
See, I think that in media there's a concept where representation for the means of representation is not actually representation. It's a little wordy, but let me expand upon that. That means if you want to represent any sort of community just for the sake of representing them, or just for the sake of claiming to have diversity, that's not actual true representation. So what ends up happening is that nowadays you either have two vastly different portrayals of Muslims on two vastly different spectrums. So you either have the terrorist that blows things up, or you have like the uber liberal quote unquote Muslim that's just there to satisfy the masses, just to say that they have diversity in their project and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we can see the origins of this, right, in the Orientalism of the last 2 centuries, right? So Western writers and thinkers were really immersed by the mysticism of the East, right? So I think in some of the first films that were made that featured any type of Oriental representation, they had, bearded Arabs riding camels in the desert, waving swords, killing each other. Women would be kept covered outside, and then like in the indoor scenes, they'd always be belly dancing. And as stereotypes of the East changed, so did our representation in the media. So that kind of representation is, I think, less popular today, and more popular is showing Muslims as hijackers, kidnappers, terrorists. Muslim women are pretty much always seen as oppressed, in burqas and in niqabs. what have you.
I think that's a great point, man. I think the first example where you see like the Orient as being mysterious originally is in Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, which was filmed in 1981 or produced in 1981, and this essentially allows for a sort of mystique, a sort of unveiling of the Arab tradition. And I think you guys both make a great point. Like you see how eventually over time, within the latter half of the 2000s, especially from 2010 up until today, we see how Muslims are portrayed as terrorists, as you mentioned, hijackers and murderers. And I don't necessarily see that changing anytime soon. But at the same time, I can see how it radically changes how an individual perceives Muslims in today's society. And I feel as though that is really harmful for the Muslim community in general, because how else are we allowed to go out and adequately represent our religion or our cultures and where we're from when you have a massive media conglomerate such as the Hollywood industry or the Bollywood industry portraying Muslims in such a negative way? And that leads to a rise in Islamophobia, that leads to a rise of hate crimes. And I just feel as though perhaps there needs to be a shift in the narrative. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
Yeah, so a lot of people will say, it's film, obviously, it's fiction, right? Like, this is not meant to be real. But that's like a very bad faith argument, because the truth is that people do believe a lot of what they see in films. And this is actually reinforced. So The Siege is a movie from 1988, has, as usual, some Muslim antagonists. And I think it was kind of noteworthy because 1998 was 3 years before 2011 and the 9/11 attacks.
2001.
2001.
Sorry. Yeah.
My bad. Never forget, right?
Yeah, of course.
And so that was 3 years before, but in that movie, they actually do, like Muslim terrorists attack the World Trade Center, actually. And the lead character, the protagonist of the movie, was played by Denzel Washington, who said in a CNN interview, quote, "This is not a stereotypical view of any group of people by any means. Unfortunately, we're imitating life." So when you have a movie portraying Muslims in such a horrible way, combined with these kind of interviews, of course you're going to have this kind of thought, and it's going to penetrate into the mindset of Muslims and non-Muslims who watch the film.
So what do you think, when sometimes when Muslims are portrayed in these movies, like the good Muslims, right, quote unquote, so when they're portrayed as, like the people who snitch on the other side, or like they're the ones that are, kind of betraying like their home country or whatnot. How do you think that plays an effect into the psyche or how do you think that plays a part in our culture and how we perceive ourselves?
Yeah, that's the other dynamic, right? Like you mentioned at the beginning, it's either that we're terrorists and hijackers, or the good Muslims will often, they take a role as like an FBI informant, a CIA informant, somebody who's working against their community with Western powers, or in kind of less dramatic movies, they'll be sinners, right? So there'll be characters like Abed from Community, who is nominally Muslim, but you never see him pray. You see him drink. You see him go after girls, or not go after girls if you know Abed from Community. And so that's the only way that you can be a good Muslim, right? Is by not actually being Muslim and following Islamic values at all. You need to be able to give up your faith very easily and absorb yourself in Western desires in order to be able to be seen as a good Muslim.
I think a perfect example of that was the show Rami, or was it the movie?
It was television.
Yeah, it was on Hulu.
Yeah.
And it was really popular. I mean, the show blew up. The man got on a lot of late night talk shows, and you have to realize the man was, he was portrayed as the modern Muslim here in 2019, representing what it means to kind of struggle to find yourself here in America while also struggling with your faith. And is that an accurate, representation of Muslims in today's society? I think to a certain degree you can say yes, but at the same time many practicing Muslims look at that and they're thinking to themselves, what's going on? Like, this is, unfortunately not an accurate representation of who I am. So is it necessarily better than being portrayed as a hijacker or a terrorist or a murderer? By all means, yes. But to a certain degree, does a Muslim have to fit into these Western values and core ideals in order to be presented as good? And I think that's a huge issue.
I
Go
think
ahead.
one thing that the colonial mentality, or like the effect of colonization rather, is that the values and the principles of the Western colonizers is looked at as the default, or like what's good, and anything that slightly deviates from that is evil or backwards or something like that.
And it's something that needs to be changed always, right? So in a lot of these shows, you'll also find like the like this one Spanish television show called Elite, in that the Muslim girl kind of learns that she is not really supposed to wear hijab, and so as the show progresses, she actually takes it off, right? Even though she wore it in the first episode. And this is not just popular in Hollywood and Western television, but also, as we mentioned in the beginning, in Bollywood, right? So in a paper written in 2013, the author contended that Bollywood cinema has exhibited an overt bias towards producing films that show Muslims in a really evil way in order to appease Hindutva ideologies. This is even before the election of Modi in 2015. So that just goes on to show that this has been a phenomenon for longer than just the latest wave of BJP victories. As Bollywood is incredibly influential, not just in India, but in all kind of Hindi or Urdu-speaking nations, our understanding nations, which includes like a bunch of countries in the Gulf, Pakistan, Bangladesh. People in all these countries watch Bollywood films, and if all they see is a representation of Muslims as evil terrorists, then that again begins to seep in to reinforce our colonial mentality.
I think that's a great point, Talha. I think it reinforces a nationalistic rhetoric and a very strong sense of pride with one's country, even if it is against other people of different cultures or different ethnicities. And you see this can lead, like I mentioned before, to hate crimes. And a perfect example of this would be, for example, Nazi Germany, where they did utilize media and newspaper outlets and radio in order to effectively convince the population that Jews were the reason for the economic downfall of Germany at the time. Another great point, just to hop back to Hollywood, is an article written by Rubina Ramji on November 16, 2016. And the article is titled "From Navy SEALs to the Siege, Getting to Know the Muslim Terrorist Hollywood Style." And she clarifies the point we previously made, which is Mythic Arabia was originally depicted as bearded Arabs riding, camels and riding horses through the desert. And then all of a sudden, you see these old stereotypes being replaced by new ones, as mentioned before. The sheikh or the wealthy Arab is now depicted as, the terrorist or the guy on the plane with a bomb or the murderer. So when you have these two huge money-making industries in Bollywood and Hollywood, you can see how that sort of influence kind of plays a role in our upbringing and how we view other individuals. And this kind of goes back to the colonized mindset. Like, how do we allow ourselves to be influenced by a media conglomerate that doesn't necessarily understand what's going on in our lives on a daily basis? You may interact with Muslims, a Hindu can interact with Muslims on a daily basis, and a lot of non-Muslims interact with Muslims on a daily basis, and you will rarely ever see a Muslim spit, terrorist rhetoric or anti-American rhetoric. For just a small example, you will rarely say someone hate on America from that sense. So I think you have a massive misrepresentation of Muslims, whether it be here in America or whether it be through Bollywood in India. But a lot of people just consume it. They eat it up because it's always tossed in with some form of comedy or some sort of romance story that kind of just sweeps everything under the rug. And I think that's a huge problem as well.
And also another kind of dimension to this is that This plays back into the colonial mentality that Frantz Fanon was talking about in The Wretched of the Earth, where it's affected and seeped into our psychology, in that we still perceive Hollywood and Bollywood as our main sources of entertainment, and we still respect them to this degree, even though they constantly and consistently produce really negative images of us. So rather than improving and creating our own film industries where we can have positive portrayals of ourselves and in a way that we feel represents us and befits us, we still cling on to Hollywood and Bollywood because that colonial mentality has seeped so far into it. Another place where the colonial mentality has seeped really far is our worship of not just Western entertainment through film, but also Western sport.
Generally speaking, sports is not a thing that's used to divide people. Like we look at all sorts of different sports like basketball and football and all these sports. Usually people across all, racial lines and political lines, they all come together and they kind of watch these, freaks of nature compete at the top of level, at the top of like any level in humanity. Like they compete and they show us what the best performance in that sport is, and we like to watch it. But there's a few sports where the colonized mentality, like, it presents itself. So like in previously colonized nations, I have noticed a trend that's not manifest anywhere else. Sports is being used to divide nations that were never supposed to be divided in the first place. So we see this manifest in many different ways. And like the first, and like one of the many sports that it manifests itself is, it's in like UFC, mixed martial arts, and boxing. Or basically, if you want to categorize them all together, it would be like combat sports. You see lots of world champions come out of the Russia, Chechnya, and like Dagestan area of the world. Like we have Habib Nurmagomedov, we have Zabit, who inshallah is going to be like a future champion. We also have one of the most dominant heavyweight champions of our era in boxing, Vladimir Klitschko. And this man, ruled over the entire heavyweight division for long periods of time. And if we look at other boxing champions, like Lomachenko, for example, he's from a different part, not necessarily like Russia, but he's still from that same area in the world. And the way that the leadership in these countries exploits these sports champions is that they use them as propaganda tools. They parade them around. Every time, Habib has a title defense now, he goes and he meets with Putin. And, Putin is not the best person, to put it very lightly. He tortures people, he kills people, he's behind he's orchestrating millions of deaths in Syria and other places in the world.
Yeah, Putin, it's not just that, besides all of Russian internal politics, Putin actually got his rise during the Second Chechen War, where he led the siege of Grozny and massacred hundreds of thousands of Muslims within Chechnya and Ingushetia. And for the only way for a Muslim from that region now to progress is to pay homage to this leader who killed so many of his own people to begin with, and this really shows the sinking of the colonial mentality into Muslims, where the disease of nationalism that we talked about in episode 1 rears its ugly head again, in that the only way to get ahead in mixed martial arts or UFC is to ally yourself with a nation, even as that nation may have persecuted your own people just a couple decades ago.
Yeah, so another place that we see this manifest itself is in one of the most, in fact, the most popular sport in the world, which is cricket. And cricket originally is a sport that was invented by the British. So there's actually a very interesting New York Times article that was written about cricket. And it states in that article that sport has a rich history in the former British Empire. It was initially limited to white colonizers. The way that they used the sport, these colonizers, when they came to places like India, and all the places where cricket is now played, they came and they, quote, cricket was the ultimate colonial civilizer. So this means that they tried to use cricket and their sports to colonize these nations and to impose their culture upon these colonized nations. And
there's a famous tale about Jinnah. I don't know. It's apocryphal. I don't know how true it is, but it says that in his youth he would look down at the other children who would be playing marbles in the dust, and he'd say, "Get up and play cricket like a civilized man." Muhammad Ali Jinnah, that's the founder of the modern nation of Pakistan.
So, like, who is he to say that playing cricket is quote unquote civilized? Why is that? The way it manifests itself is by saying that we viewed the colonized, we viewed the sport of cricket as a sport of the colonizers, which was superior to our indigenous sports.
And I think another point, not necessarily relevant to Pakistan, but more relevant to Afghanistan, is a quote by a political and sports analyst based in Kabul. His name's Hamid Almi, and he mentions how, and I quote, "Politicians do use the sport for their political purposes, and that exacerbates ethnic tensions." And you have to realize you have Pashtuns, which are the dominant ethnic group in Afghanistan for centuries, and tensions between them and like other groups such as the Tajiks and Hazaras. That really burst when you had the Civil War in the 1990s. However, in modern society, 2020, we're looking at efforts to heal that division all throughout the 2000s and 2010s. And the schism still actually exists, but now it exists in the cricket open field. It doesn't exist with guns and swords anymore. It exists with bats and balls.
Yeah, so the way that this has manifested itself, and I keep saying that again and again, is because the goal of colonizers, right, is to come into a place, invade it, and then impose your culture over them, impose your culture over the people that you're invading, basically. So a lot of people, some of the views that people have is that that they're kind of, whenever India or Pakistan, if they ever beat a colonial country like the British, for example, right, it's kind of there's like the stigma behind it where, oh yeah, we're getting back at the colonizers. So I actually disagree with that, because the entire goal of the colonizers, right, conquer and divide. So they want to split us up, and they don't want us to have unity within ourselves. So the way they use cricket, I mean, first of all, it would be a completely different discussion if like it was a fair sport. Like there's evidence of rigging and being impartial in judging these contests and whatnot. So
it's still being used to divide us, right? The Indian-Pakistani rivalry in cricket is extremely notorious for being one of the biggest rivalries of any sports teams in the world, and this competition is used to drive a further wedge between the two countries, actually, which were obviously divided up by the British, as we all know. In 1947, this border never existed before in history, but it does now thanks to the British and through the sport, which the cricket MCB, their national kind of cricket board, ruled over the ICC, the International Cricket Council, for the longest time. Their will was kind of imposed in there, and that's why in the 2000s, it was pretty famous for that when Pakistani or brown kind of teams tampered with the ball, which happens often in cricket, the umpires would call them out right away, suspend players, get players totally disqualified. Whereas when white teams like England, Australia, New Zealand, they tampered with the ball, it wasn't considered a major offense, and often the umpire looked it over and said, "Oh, these players have made a mistake, but we should forgive them," and that plays itself greatly in the sport to this day.
Now, I think an interesting point to look at also from the colonizers' perspective is that when English attempted to introduce this sport, to Indians, Pakistanis, and eventually all across the world. One of the initial things that came with the sport is its etiquette and its mannerism. And the foundation for that is imitating essentially the master or the colonizer. And this began by introducing social norms and etiquettes with the sport itself. And one of the early cricket manuals dispensed actually included the rules and regulations that were originally designed by the quote-unquote white man. And that plays a role in how cricket is viewed as like the ultimate colonizer, and allows for these quote-unquote uncivilized populations of people, indigenous people in India and Pakistan, to become civilized. And I think we've allowed it to almost become a way, as Ibrahim mentioned earlier, a way for us to get back at the colonizers by winning the sport. But we don't necessarily see the bigger picture, which is, why do we even play the sport in the first place? Why do we care about it so much? Why does it hold so much weight? Why do we fight, especially from a Muslim perspective, why do we fight amongst each other in terms of countries, in terms of nationalistic pride? What does it even mean? I mean, this is a much deeper look at it. What does it even mean to be Pakistani or Indian? Why? And I think we mentioned this in our last episode too.
We did, yeah.
The arbitrary lines that form a country, why do we hold it so tight to our heart? And this is just something I think, Ibrahim, if you want to go ahead and expand upon.
In the article it says that what is the first thing that happens when Pakistan and India make peace? They play a cricket match. So this kind of shows that we've put so much weight behind a sport that essentially is not ours, and we are trying to we put so much weight and importance that this sport holds political significance. And we should, kind of, let me quote again. The most important quote over here is that cricket was the ultimate colonial civilizer. So we're taking a sport that, that all Indians and, Pakistanis especially, because that's our backgrounds a little bit over here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we love that sport so much, and we really have to look at ourselves and ask ourselves, why do we love it?
Mm-hmm. I think... I think you were referring to Joseph O'Neill's book called the quote-unquote Netherland, which is published in 2008. And I think this really introduces the concept of cricket culture in New York and America, per se. And as you mentioned, man, I'm simply mind-boggled when it comes down to why we put so much emphasis on this sport, why we look up to the individuals that created this sport, when the whole purpose of the sport essentially... I can't necessarily say the whole purpose, but one of the major intentions in formulating the sport and introducing it to indigenous populations was to put people down.
Yeah, it's not necessarily that playing the sport itself is bad, but that we play it according to a system that was set up by our colonizers. I don't have a problem with taking a bat and, hitting a ball, bowling a ball and trying to hit a wicket, but... the fact that on the world stage it's still controlled mostly by Western nations, or now India has a greater control on it. But as we discussed when we were talking about film, is that India is also unfortunately quite antagonistic to many Muslims.
Yeah, look, so we should like we said at the end of our our film and Hollywood piece, right? We should take a deeper look into why we do the things that we do, and why do we love cricket so much? Why does it play such an important role in our politics and our life, and how the film and Hollywood and Bollywood, why do they play such an important role in our life? And is that because they genuinely do, or were these systems and were these things a result of the colonized mentality that we have? Another way that the colonized mentality manifests itself in our culture is that the role of racism and institutionalized racism in our society. I know Ali, you have something to say about this.
Yeah, I think this plays a much bigger role when it comes to almost any industry you're looking at, whether it be the film industry, whether it be sports, whether it be news and media. One of the big things you have to look at originally is what defines ethnicity and race. So you have to understand the foundations before you can even address the major issues. And one great book that I was able to obtain definitions from that really clarified the role of race and ethnicity amongst all aspects of society, is Essentials of Sociology. And one of the main authors was Dr. Anthony Giddens. And Dr. Anthony Giddens is actually, he was a director of the London School of Economics. And he plays a major role when it comes to deciphering economic and social ideologies and theories. So from the book itself, it defines ethnicity, and I'm quoting here, it refers to cultural practices and outlooks of a given community that have emerged historically and tend to set people apart. So that can be language, history, religious affiliation, or even the style of dress that people wear. Now, that's ethnicity. What about race? Race in itself can really be understood as a classification system. So this assigns individuals into like groups or categories. And to be honest, there are really no clear-cut races, but there are really a range of physical characteristics that people have. What are your thoughts on that?
So how would these classifications, I don't know if you're familiar with the caste system in India.
Mm-hmm.
So how would these classifications, kind of correlate with that?
Well, in both cases, the thing to understand about race is that it's straight up made up, right? It's a social construct, and it was largely created actually not even very long ago. The thing is that in the past, people didn't really see race exactly the way we do today, and they classified humans differently. In fact, like we have an idea where we love to take the races that we've come up with today and apply them to the past. So we think of the Roman Empire as a white empire. Mm-hmm. But the fact of the matter is that, some of the emperors were of Arab descent, some of them were of African descent, and for sure their skin colors and, hair types, whatever else kind of weird characteristics and features people in the last couple centuries came up with to distinguish races did not really, affect those people. They didn't see race exactly the way we do. They didn't actually conceptualize race at all the way we do. And it's clear that it's a social construct.
Yeah, I think one of the major things we have to look at from a sociological perspective when it comes to race is how many sociologists in modern society, they generally cohere with a theory of racial formation. And this is originally produced by Dr. Michael Omi and Dr. Howard Winant. And this was in a book on racial formation. The book's title is Racial Formation in the United States. This was published in 1994. And they defined racial formation, or the theory of it, as the process by which social, economic, and political forces determine the content and importance of racial categories. I personally cannot think of a more clear-cut definition. I think in this, it fits perfectly when it comes to the colonized mindset, how you see this play a big role when it comes to Europeans colonizing North Africa, Egypt, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and essentially also here in America, when you look at Americans' attitudes towards slavery and African Americans, even to this day. So biological features, unfortunately, seem to play a massive role in today's society, and these racial meanings have led to the colonized mindset being imported on the mindset of many migrants and immigrants, and even here in America, when you see Pakistani or Indian colonized people that migrate over to America, they seem to have this inherent bias towards African Americans and Latinos almost. Talha, do you want to go ahead and expound upon that as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just immigrants from the old countries who come over here. It's prevalent in those colonized countries, those formerly colonized countries themselves. And actually, another way that this racism manifests is because the understanding of race is less solidified over there. A lot of times it just develops into rampant colorism. And I understand that racism and colorism are two different issues, but in the colonized mentality, often they come in a similar kind of package. So I know the three of us here are from South Asia, and for sure it's prevalent over there, but it's also prevalent in African countries like Sudan and Mauritania, Morocco, where people who are darker are often just considered kind of lower. Like it's actually a good trait to be fair-skinned. This is definitely leftover colonial mentality within us, and this especially impacts women who are constantly told that that especially ones with darker skin tone are told that they're not enough, right? And then the greedy companies also obviously get their share of this, where they start producing really harmful skin bleaching and skin whitening products that aren't approved by any government, that aren't approved by most scientists, and they do much more harm in the long term than they even like clear up skin or anything. But women's there's a big demand for this in those countries because of this colonial mentality.
Yeah, so you see that these companies take advantage of these institutionalized racism, like these racial norms that have been put into society, where especially if you look in back home in India, Pakistan, and even in Asia. Have you guys ever seen that commercial? There was this Asian lady. She had I guess her boyfriend was an African, or he was black, and then this was an ad for a skin whitening cream. And so she basically takes him and she puts him in a clothes like a washing machine, right, for clothes.
Wow.
And then the guy comes out and he's Asian and he's super fair skinned. We've become conditioned to think that the fairer you are, the more you look better than the person that's darker than you.
Yeah, it's disgusting, and it's a clear leftover of the colonial mentality within us that we really need to work to eradicate, And
I feel as though our generation can do a great job when it comes to promoting racial equality. I think we have the opportunity to look past race because we weren't directly affected by it as our parents were.
I think maybe instead of looking past race, I think we should acknowledge race, and we should try to treat each other as fairly as possible. I mean, I'm gonna give you a really personal example that that we see in just our own society or our own communities. I'm not gonna name any names or give any locations, but we go to the mosque, right? And after the prayer we play basketball.
Yeah.
And there was a certain time where we used to play basketball outside, outdoors, and so we the masjid security, right?
Yeah,
they're
of
always walking around, and they're checking on us.
Yeah.
And one thing I always noticed, right, and this is again institutionalized racism that we encounter. So every time they would see a black person come onto the court, they would slowly walk towards. They would walk inside. They would walk inside the court and see what's going on. And I would notice this every single time. Someone who didn't look Arab or Pakistani or anybody like that. So we really have to take a deep look at ourselves and see and acknowledge our racism basically, and try to overcome it.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. Another one that I personally experienced myself was when I was actually in the gym the other day, and there was a brother. He was about 6'9", 6'10". Dude straight up looked like Shaq, and he acknowledged that too. And he was wearing a tank top, full tats. When it came to his chest, he had arm sleeves when it came to tats, and on his back as well. And we just started working out, and it wasn't until he asked me, "Hey, are you Muslim?" And I said, "Yes, alhamdulillah, I'm Muslim." And he said salam to me, and it wasn't until that moment that I kind of, we broke the ice. Before that, for some weird reason, I had this inherent sense of fear, and it was completely irrational. It didn't make any sense to me, but looking back on how I was brought up and how society kind of played a role in how I perceive race, I can see how I was affected by that in that specific example. One thing that people don't necessarily take into account is also how racism plays a role in how we raise our children. And I think that's something that really needs to be rectified, especially with our generation. And we have the opportunity to fix it. We have the opportunity to break barriers and reestablish, racial equality here in America. And I feel as though hopefully we can work towards that in some manner.
And the first step in this is identifying and acknowledging that we have a problem in our cultures here and back home, right? We have this rampant racism and colorism, and wherever it originated from, the point of this podcast is to be explicit that it did originate from our experience with colonization. The fact of the matter is that we have our own agency now, and we are able to free ourselves from that, and that's what we need to work towards.
Well, Talha, I'm going to cut you off right there, man. I think we're about to approach wellness, the topic of wellness, specifically educational wellness right there. But for those of you listening, once again, you can always help us grow by giving us a follow on Instagram at @thefourth.productions and Twitter at @thefourth_prod, PROD. And we hope that you folks will tune in next week for the next episode on the topic of wellness in regards to the colonized mind.